My name is Dorothy Elridge, and the last time I wore black, it wasn't for fashion. It was to bury my husband. Martin and I had been married for 49 years. Not all of them perfect, but every one of them real. When we bought this house, it was a stretch. A 2-bedroom lakefront cottage with a leaky roof and squirrels in the attic. We fixed it. We filled it. We made it into a life. Now he was gone. And I was left behind, not just with memories, but with that same house, that same roof, and a silence that rattled deeper than the pipes. I didn't expect the children to understand. Grief is different when it doesn't sit in your own bones. But I never imagined that less than a month after Martin's funeral, I'd find myself sitting at the dining room table staring across at my son's softly patronizing smile and my daughter's perfectly rehearsed concern. Mom said Philip, placing his hand over mine like I was already halfway to dementia. "We've been talking. You know, about next steps." "Next steps," I echoed. My fingers curled around the teacup I hadn't touched. "Yes," said Elise, her voice syrupy. "About the house. It's a lot to maintain for one person. And it's not safe with all these stairs." I looked around. These weren't just walls. They were shelves for my life. The framed poems Martin used to write. The water stains on the ceiling where we once tried and failed to fix a pipe ourselves. Even the back door with the dent where Scout, the golden retriever we'd rescued, used to scratch when he wanted out. Now Scout was old like me. His fur had gone gray around the snout, and he followed me from room to room like a silent witness. "The real estate market is great right now," Elise added. "You could make a fortune." There it was. The word fortune. Not safety. Not simplicity. Fortune. I smiled the way polite women are trained to. "I see," I said. "And what would you suggest I do instead?" "Oh," Elise brightened, reaching for her phone. "There's this beautiful condo complex close to us, gated lots of retirees. And it's only a short drive from where the kids go to school." How convenient. They wanted me nearby, but only in a smaller box. One that didn't come with a mortgage-free lake view and 2 acres of land. One that could be sold split and someday passed down. "Of course we want what's best for you," Philip added. "You don't have to decide right now. Just think about it." I promised I would. That night, as I let Scout outside and stood barefoot on the porch, I looked at the sky Martin used to love. The stars always look closer from here, he'd once told me. They still did. But everything else felt farther away. I didn't sleep much. The next day, I found Elise in the kitchen before I even came down the stairs. She had a folder open, the smell of coffee in the air, and a too casual tone in her voice. "I just wanted to check the property tax bill," she said. "I know it came in recently." I said nothing. She knew where the drawer was, but I watched her fingers fumble a little too long in the files. That wasn't what she was looking for. That evening, I called my husband's lawyer. "Martin left the house in your name, only Mr. Trask told me, confirming what I already suspected. "You're the sole owner, Dorothy." I thanked him. And I didn't tell a soul. The next Sunday they all came again. Philip, Elise, their spouses, their children. Everyone chatting over lasagna like this wasn't an ambush with baked cheese. Elise even brought Scout a bag of grain-free dog treats. A bribe for me, really. "So have you had time to think?" Philip asked. "I have," I said, nodding. And I smiled. And I lied. "Maybe you're right. It's time." You should have seen the flicker in their eyes. The greed just beneath the grateful tears. I told them I needed a week. To go through things. To say goodbye to the place. They nodded. They hugged. They left. Scout looked at me from the kitchen threshold. "I know," I whispered, running my fingers through his fur. "They think we're folding, but we're not." Because I had already started packing. And I wasn't going to the condo. I was going home, just not the one they planned for me. I spent the next few days doing what they expected me to do, only not in the way they imagined. They thought I'd start boxing up dishes, old quilts, maybe give away Martin's tools. They thought I'd weep into my tea while sorting memories and wondering what size storage unit to rent. Instead, I opened the cedar chest at the foot of our bed and pulled out the folder Martin left for me. Tucked inside were things no one else knew about. The deed in my name alone, our backup savings account documents, and a handwritten note with an address we hadn't talked about in years. A cabin, The one we almost bought 20 years ago before the kids were married, before life got complicated. It sat on 3 acres near an old logging trail upstate. Martin loved it. I said it was too remote, but he bought the lot anyway quietly, in case he'd said we ever needed a place to disappear. I guess he'd seen this coming before I had. Scout followed me everywhere now, his slow paws padding through each room as I sorted what really mattered. The rest heirlooms, furniture, the tea set Elise pretended to love. I left exactly where they were. Let them decide who gets what. They'd already started planning my exit. I was just going to make it easier for them. Elise dropped by Wednesday morning. She brought croissants and that bright voice she only uses when she wants something. I found a moving company, Mom. They can pack everything for you, even handle donations. How thoughtful, I replied. I've already made arrangements. She blinked. You have? Yes. Quietly, like always. She laughed, not realizing that was the last time she'd ever step inside this house. Thursday evening, I called a locksmith. Changed every code, every deadbolt. Not because I thought they'd rob me, but because I knew they already had, just in a different way. They took for granted that I'd fold. That grief made me soft. But grief made me sharp. Sharp enough to remember that silence is often a strategy. I booked a rental car under a different name. Packed 2 bags, one for me, one for Scout. I folded Martin's flannel jacket into mine. He used to wear it on cold mornings when he sat on the porch with his coffee. It still smelled like pine and pipe tobacco. Friday morning came gray and quiet. Rain threatened but never arrived. I stood in the hallway for a long time, just staring at the front door. The wood was worn at the bottom where Scout used to paw when he was younger. I knelt, kissed that spot. Come on, boy, I whispered. Time to go home. We left before sunrise. Not a sound. Not a note. Just the soft click of the front door closing behind us. I didn't look back. The cabin was 3 hours north. Tucked behind a mossy drive and veiled in tall pines, it sat exactly as Martin had described, slightly overgrown, but solid. The porch creaked when I stepped on it, and the inside smelled like old cedar and possibility. Scout sniffed every corner before settling down in front of the wood-burning stove like he'd always belonged here. I stood in the middle of the one-room cottage and let the silence pour over me, not empty this time, but full of breath. Full of choice. I was gone, and they wouldn't know where, and that was the power. Later that night, I turned off my phone, but not before I saw the messages start coming in. Hey Mom, just checking in. Mom, we're trying to finalize the condo paperwork, give me a call. Where are you? They weren't worried. They were cornered, because they had assumed control of something that was never theirs. On the 3rd night in the cabin, I lit the fireplace and sat with a cup of tea. Scout lay at my feet, eyes half-closed, chest rising and falling with soft rhythm. I took out Martin's note again, the one with the address and just 4 words below it. When they forget you. He knew. Somehow he always did. The fire crackled. The trees whispered in the dark, and I felt something I hadn't in weeks. Not anger. Not sadness. Satisfaction. Let them call. Let them knock. Let them panic. They had tried to reduce me to a square footage, and I had just redefined the map. Scout woke before I did. The soft thud of his tail against the cabin floor was what stirred me. He always waited to be sure I was ready to rise, never whined, never barked. Just loyal, just there, the kind of loyalty I once expected from my children. I boiled water on the old propane stove and stepped outside with a chipped ceramic mug in hand. The mist was lifting from the trees, and in the distance the lake glinted through a curtain of pines. This place, the cabin Martin never got to finish, was raw and unfinished, but it breathed. The phone sat on the porch railing next to me. I turned it on knowing I shouldn't, knowing it would pull me back into their noise. 37 missed calls, 19 voicemails. I scrolled, not listening, just reading the captions. Mom, call us back. Please. You can't just disappear like this. You're being unreasonable. You're scaring the kids. We need to know what's happening with the house. And then, I just spoke with the realtor, she said. The property deed is only under your name. Is that true? There it was. The veil pulled back. Not concern. Not confusion. Not family. Just exposure. They had gone behind my back, listed the home, with an agent started planning showings, never once thinking they should ask me if I was ready. Because to them I wasn't a person, I was a piece of the estate. That night, I lay on the couch wrapped in Martin's old flannel. Scout snored on the floor beside me. I stared at the wooden beams above my head and thought about how many Thanksgivings I had cooked while Elise took phone calls and Philip watched football. I thought about the time they forgot my birthday until the cake was already in the fridge. I thought about how I had always told myself they were busy, tired, distracted, but never unkind. Because a mother's heart invents excuses for her children, but grief has a way of burning those lies down, and the ashes make things so clear. The next morning, I got a knock on the cabin door. I froze. No one should have known where I was. Then came the voice, faint, tentative. "Mom, are you in there?" "Philip." I opened the door just enough to see him. He looked like he hadn't shaved in a few days. Jacket too light for the cold. Phone in hand. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my voice firm. "I tracked the parcel number," he said. "The one from Dad's old paperwork." I remembered the address. "Of course," I said quietly. "So it's not that you came looking for me. You came looking for the house." He blinked. "No. Mom, come on. We're worried." "No. You're exposed." He paused. "Why didn't you tell us?" "Tell you what?" I said. "That your father trusted me to protect what we built. That the house wasn't yours to offer or list or even imagine splitting." He said nothing. "Tell me something, Philip. If I had signed the papers, if I'd sold the house and moved into that beige box of a condo, what would have happened to Scout?" He looked at the dog, then away. "You told Elise he was too much for me now." "Oi, you thought I didn't hear?" He shifted, guilt etched into every wrinkle around his eyes. "I didn't mean—" "You meant it," I interrupted. "You meant all of it. You meant to erase me before I even finished grieving." He tried to step closer. I didn't move. "I want to fix this," he said. I nodded slowly. "Then start by leaving." His lips parted like he had something else to say, but he didn't. He turned, walked back down the gravel path toward his rental car. Scout watched from the doorway, ears perked. I shut the door gently behind me. Later, I opened my phone again. One message stood out. It was from Elise. "Why are you doing this? We're family." Family. The word hit like cold glass. That night, I lit the fire in the wood stove, took out an old notebook, and started writing. Not a journal. A will. The one Martin and I had drafted before he passed hadn't been updated. The kids were listed, but now I had other ideas. Ideas that had names, causes I'd volunteered for, local charities. Martin once loved the Librarians Foundation that had once helped me save the history section from being gutted. If they thought I was a soft woman with nothing left to give, they were about to learn what legacy really means. I stayed up most of that night with Scout curled by the fire and the sound of pine branches swaying against the windows. There was something sacred about the quiet here, like even the silence had memory. Martin had always called it the hum of nothing, and I was finally beginning to understand what he meant. I finished the first draft of my new will just before sunrise. The house still in my name would never go to my children. The lakefront land would be donated to the county for wildlife preservation. The cabin, which I now officially owned, would pass to a foundation for older women who'd been abandoned or manipulated by family. I made sure the language was airtight. I had been a librarian, yes, but I spent a decade working with estate archives, and I knew how the legal world buried women like me in footnotes and loopholes. Not this time. I found a small local attorney in the nearby town Greenville population, barely 4,000er. Her name was Connie. She wore flannel shirts and hiking boots to her office and served me tea before asking what brought me in. When I explained, she didn't flinch. "My grandmother went through something similar," she said. "Took back her farm after her sons tried to ship her to Arizona." I smiled. "Let's make this bulletproof," I told her. And we did. The more I poured into the will, the more I realized I wasn't just cutting ties. I was planting something new, something that wouldn't rot with guilt or grow tangled in obligation. I added a clause. If either child tried to contest the document, they'd forfeit any future contact or consideration. I added Scout too, made sure that he would never be taken to a shelter or given away. He was to remain protected until his final day, and after he'd be buried by the lake. It may seem foolish giving a dog that kind of honor, but Martin once said Scout had more integrity in one paw than most men carried in their whole bodies. He wasn't wrong. A week passed. I received another letter, this one postmarked from Elise. It wasn't handwritten. Just a printed email sealed in an envelope, sterile, efficient, and full of pretense. Dear Mom, I'm sorry if you misunderstood our intentions. We just wanted what's best for you. You disappearing like this isn't fair to anyone. The kids miss you. Let's talk about options. Options. As if I were a menu item or a spare chair. Scout looked up at me as I tore the letter into pieces and fed it to the fire. He thumped his tail once against the floor, then went back to sleep. I didn't respond. Some silences are sentences in themselves. The next morning, I drove into town for supplies. Flour, coffee, a few hinges for the back door. At the checkout line, I ran into an old friend, Loretta, who used to work with me at the library. Dorothy. She blinked. My lord, I heard you'd vanished. Just relocated, I said, smiling. I saw Philip last week. He said you were taking time for yourself. She hesitated. Though, it didn't sound like a choice. It wasn't, I said, until I made it one. Loretta's face changed, softened. Good for you, she said quietly. They always think we're too tired to fight back. Turns out I said I was just resting up. Back at the cabin, I started restoring what Martin had left half finished. I fixed the squeaky screen door. I repainted the window frames. I even unearthed the rusted mailbox from beneath a thicket of ferns and planted it proudly by the road. A neighbor, a retired carpenter named Sam, dropped by to introduce himself after hearing Scout barking one afternoon. Didn't think anyone would ever move in, he said. Place has been empty for years. Until now, I replied. He offered to help me install a new stovepipe. I offered him coffee and quiet in return. It felt like a fair trade. Slowly, the cabin wasn't just a place of escape. It was becoming a home. My home. Not the one my children thought they could slice into pieces. Not the one with a memory of being almost erased. But one I had chosen. On purpose. That evening, I sat on the porch with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders. The lake shimmered below, dark and endless. Scout lay with his head on my feet. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt something better. Unburdened. In the distance, the owl began its low, steady call. And for the first time in a long time, I answered with laughter. Let them worry. Let them scramble and guess. Because the truth is, I was never downsizing. I was rewilding. A week later, I received a voicemail from Elise. Her voice was tight, controlled. The kind of control that only comes from desperation being shoved behind a smile. Hi, Mom. We're confused. We stopped by the house and it's locked. The realtor said she couldn't get access and your phone's been off for days. Can you please call me back? She paused. I don't know what's going on, but it's not okay. We need to talk about the sale. It's not just about you anymore. There are other people involved. Click. I didn't call back. Not because I wanted to be cruel, but because that last sentence said everything. It's not just about you anymore. As if the house, the land, my grief, and my very name had somehow been absorbed into a family ledger, a line item they were trying to balance. I leaned back in the chair beside the fireplace, the same chair Martin used when he wanted to think. Scout, now dreaming on the rug, gave a twitch of his paw and a quiet woof, as if chasing something in his sleep. We had done nothing wrong, but to them my independence had become an inconvenience. The next day I took a walk through the pine woods behind the cabin. Martin and I had hiked these trails years ago when we first visited the property. We'd spoken then of maybe turning it into a retreat when we were older. I want a place where no one expects anything from us, he'd said. No obligations. No performance. Just breath. I hadn't understood the weight of those words then. Now I did. At the base of a moss-covered tree, I found one of the trail markers he'd carved. Just a small arrow and an M. E. His initials. I ran my fingers over the old wood, half-rotted but still legible. He had planned for this. Maybe not the betrayal, but the need for escape. The need for restoration. I whispered, "Thank you," and pressed my hand to the tree. That afternoon, Philip called. This time, he didn't bother with pleasantries. Mom, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but the lawyer said we have no rights to the property. You seriously didn't think we deserved to know that Dad left the deed in your name only? I didn't answer. He went on. Elise and I have been counting on this. You have no idea what kind of pressure we're under. The kids are starting school and we've got 2 mortgages and, there it was again. The house wasn't shelter anymore. It was leverage. I just wish you'd been honest with us, he said, voice sharp. I'm starting to think you're punishing us for something. Punishing. No, I thought. But protecting myself. Absolutely. That evening I wrote a letter. But not to them. I wrote to myself, Dorothy, you are allowed to claim your peace. You are allowed to reject manipulation disguised as love. You are allowed to exist without explanation. They will call you cruel for walking away. But the truth is, leaving was the first kind thing you've done for yourself in decades. I folded the letter, sealed it, and placed it in Martin's old cigar box. A record. Not for them. For me. The next morning I received a new voicemail. This time from Elise's husband. It was shorter. We'll be consulting our attorney. If there's something you're hiding, we'll find out. I almost laughed. Hiding. I wasn't hiding. I was living. Scout and I spent the afternoon reorganizing the old storage shed beside the cabin. Martin had kept extra tools out there, a few of which had rusted, but most were still intact. I found a half-finished birdhouse he'd been building. I sanded it down, finished the edges, painted it soft blue, and hung it on a pine tree just outside the window. A message maybe, even if only to myself, you can build new things, even after they try to take everything. That night the stars came out early and bold. I brought Scout a blanket and sat beside him on the porch. The lake was still, a mirror to everything that no longer moved inside me. It struck me how much louder my children had become since I fell silent. They were rattled not by my words, but by their absence. They expected me to cry, to plead, to compromise. Instead, I'd quietly rewritten every rule. And now they were left with the echo of their own assumptions. I took a sip of chamomile tea and exhaled deeply. They wanted me to downsize. So I did. I downsized the noise, the guilt, the generational weight of being agreeable, and what I had left was peace. It was just after sunrise when I saw the SUV pulling up the gravel road. I had just finished my coffee and was about to take Scout for his morning walk. But the sight of that sleek silver vehicle winding its way up the forest path made me pause at the porch steps. Philip again. This time Elise was with him. I didn't go inside. I didn't hide. I stood on the porch in my worn flannel coat, Scout by my side, and waited. They parked without speaking, climbed out and approached like people rehearsing a play they weren't sure would end well. Mom, Elise said, voice too light. We just wanted to talk. In person. I nodded, said nothing. Philip folded his arms. This is getting ridiculous. I tilted my head. Is it? You're isolating yourself, Elise said, taking a half step forward. And you're shutting us out when all we've ever tried to do is help you. That made me laugh. Just once, low and short. You're not here to help me, I said. You're here because your plans unraveled. Philip bristled. We're trying to find a solution. There's nothing to solve, I replied calmly. You misunderstood the equation. You thought the house was yours to divide? You forgot who built it. They stood in awkward silence. Elise looked around the property like she was seeing it for the first time. Not as an escape, not as an exile, but as a choice. My choice. Scout wagged his tail once and let out a soft woof. Elise crouched down to him, reached to pat his head. He's gotten older, she said. He's earned it, I replied. So have I. Philip exhaled. So that's it. You're just going to stay here forever. I looked at the cabin, at the pine trees swaying, at the birds flitting between the feeders I'd put up just days ago. Yes, I said. But what about the rest of us? Elise asked. What about family? You've redefined that word so many times. I no longer know what it means to you, I said. To me it means presence, respect, and love that doesn't come with strings or signatures. Elise opened her mouth, then shut it again. I stepped forward down the porch steps. I'm not angry, I said. But I am done pretending that your convenience should come at the cost of my dignity. They didn't argue. They didn't apologize. They just stood there realizing they had no power here. And I had no desire to make them feel better about that fact. They left shortly after, No hugs, no goodbyes. Just a quiet retreat down the road they hadn't expected to travel, at least not in defeat. I watched until their car disappeared into the trees. Then I turned back to Scout. "Let's go finish the garden bed," I said. And we did. That afternoon, I sat down to write a letter not to my children, but to the County Land Trust. I offered the lakefront property and the surrounding forest, with a request to protect it in Martin's name. I attached a copy of my new will and asked for a memorial plaque near the dock he had built. I didn't cry while writing it, but I did feel something deep settle into my chest. A root. I was no longer drifting. I was planting. That night, I found an old cassette Martin had made years ago, his voice reading poetry into a recorder. His favorite piece. Wendell Berry's The Peace of Wild Things. I come into the peace of wild things, who do not tax their lives with forethought. Of grief. I come into the presence of still water. I played it twice. Scout lay beside me, and for a moment I swore Martin was right there with us, smiling, nodding, proud. I hadn't needed to shout to be heard. I hadn't needed to fight to win. All I had needed was to leave the door unlocked for myself, and to close it gently on everyone else. The calls stopped. Maybe they'd finally understood. Or maybe they'd moved on to the next thing that needed dividing. Either way, the silence was the kindest sound I'd heard in months. I filled my mornings with motion chopping kindling, pulling weeds, repairing the old bench that faced the lake. The ache in my joints was a different kind of pain now. Purposeful, earned. My body reminded me I was alive, not fading. Scout had a new spring in his step, too. He walked longer, barked at squirrels again, even chased a rabbit down the trail before giving up halfway and flopping into the ferns, panting. At night, we shared the couch, a blanket, and whatever I had simmered on the stove. I started reading again, old mystery novels, a few dog-eared poetry books, and even Martin's journals. He wrote about this cabin more than I'd realized. Plans to install solar panels, sketches of a garden, notes on a hidden trail behind the ridge that led to a forgotten lookout. I followed that trail one cool morning and found the spot, a moss-covered rock ledge overlooking the lake, with a view so wide it felt like I was watching the world breathe. I sat there for a long time, breathing with it. One morning, while repairing a crack in the kitchen wall, I heard footsteps on the porch. But it wasn't Philip or Elise. It was Connie, the attorney. She held a manila envelope in one hand and 2 travel mugs in the other. "I brought coffee," she said, smiling. "And your final paperwork." I let her in. We sat at the old wooden table as Scout curled at our feet. "It's done," she said. "Filed, notarized, and shielded from challenge. If they come for the assets, they'll get a copy of the will and nothing else." "Perfect," I said. "Let them read it and weep." She chuckled. "You know, most people your age don't plan this thoroughly." I looked at her over the rim of my mug. "Most people my age don't get erased by their own children." She nodded slowly. "They will eventually realize what they lost." "I'm not so sure," I replied. "But that's not my burden anymore." That night, I lit a candle and placed the final will in Martin's cigar box alongside his letter, my letter to myself, and the old deed to our family home. I carried the box down to the lake, built a small fire, and one by one I burned the pieces, not out of anger, but completion. The deed turned to smoke. The old will crumbled into red ash. My note to myself lingered longest in the flame, almost reluctant to go. But it did. Martin's letter I kept. Not everything needed to be released. Some things are meant to be carried. The next morning, I received a letter in the mail, a real one, handwritten. The return address was unfamiliar. Inside was a note. "Mrs. Elridge, I'm not sure if you remember me, but I was one of your students, Jacob Myers, class of '94. I heard what happened through Loretta. I just wanted to say thank you. You once told me I was more than the mistakes I'd made, that I was allowed to rewrite my own story. I hope you've done the same, Jacob." I smiled. I hadn't remembered his face until that moment. But the words, they reached me in a place deeper than memory. That evening, I walked to the lookout again. Scout came with me, his pace slower but determined. I brought a bottle of wine Martin and I had been saving for some day. Turns out this was it. Someday. I poured a glass, raised it to the horizon. "To silence," I whispered. "To taking back what was mine. To the dog they didn't want, and the woman they underestimated. Scout barked once, then settled beside me. And in that golden hour light, I knew I hadn't downsized. I'd expanded, not in square footage, but in truth, in peace, in power. The first snow arrived early that year, soft and slow, blanketing the pine branches and frosting the roof of the cabin in a quiet hush. It reminded me of the first winter Martin and I had spent in the house. He used to joke that snow muffled the world so you could finally hear yourself think. He was right. I stood on the porch in my thickest sweater, cradling a mug of cocoa as Scout nosed through the fresh powder like a pup again. His tail wagged in slow rhythmic sweeps as he left tracks across the white canvas. Inside the cabin glowed, not just with firelight but with a kind of earned warmth, the kind that seeps into the soul when you know you've reclaimed something no one else can steal again. I spent the snow day sorting through Martin's old notebooks. One of them was labeled Cabin Dreams. Inside were sketches of a greenhouse, notes on composting, and a little to-do list in his tight, looping handwriting. Build window bench, fix squeaky hinge, add bird feeders, teach Scout to sit again. Don't let her forget who she is. That last line stopped me. It wasn't a reminder to himself. It was a message to me. I pressed my fingers to the page, closed my eyes, and let the words sink in. Martin always knew I'd try to disappear into what others needed. That I'd confuse accommodation for love, obedience for peace. He'd watched me give too much for too long. Now, in the pages of a tattered notebook, he reminded me, don't let them shrink you. A knock at the door pulled me back to the present. When I opened it, there stood Sam, the neighbor who'd helped me install the new stovepipe. He held a bundle of firewood and a thermos. Thought you might be running low, he said, and I made some chili. Come in, I said, stepping aside. We sat by the fire, Scout curled between us like a referee. Sam didn't ask questions. He just passed me a bowl, commented on the weather, and then told me about the time he fell off his roof trying to impress a woman with a Christmas light display. I laughed more than I had in months, maybe years. After he left, I walked out into the snow with Scout. The lake was still blanketed in mist. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the key to the old family home. The house they had tried to divide. The symbol of my silence. I walked to the edge of the dock and tossed it into the water. No ceremony, no anger, just release. Let them change the locks. Let them call a locksmith and wonder where the original went. Let them grasp for things that no longer matter. Because I wasn't going back. Not in body, not in spirit, not in guilt. The next morning, I received an email. It was from a lawyer I didn't recognize, someone Elise had hired. Dear Mrs. Elridge, we are writing to inquire about the legal status of your property and estate plans in light of recent family concerns. I didn't finish reading it. I forwarded it to Connie with one line, handle this. By the afternoon, I had a reply. Already did. They have no case. Everything is sealed and legally sound. I leaned back in my chair, Scout resting his head on my foot. For the first time in a long time, I felt untouchable. Not because I had built walls, but because I had rooted myself in truth. And the truth was this: I had nothing to prove, nothing to explain, and nothing left they could take from me. That night, I sat at the window and watched the snow fall in slow spirals. I thought about all the years I had been the peacemaker, the holiday host, the one who absorbed every slight with a smile. Now I was just a woman in a cabin with a dog and a fire. And for the first time in decades, that was enough. I didn't hear from them for a while after that, weeks in fact. The kind of silence that used to unnerve me when the children were young and quiet for too long. But this wasn't toddler mischief. This was adult guilt. Or strategy. I wasn't sure which. Scout and I fell into a rhythm. Morning walks, warm meals, repairs when the weather allowed. I started keeping a journal again, not to document pain, but to trace the rebuilding of my own identity. One day I wrote, I am not what they call me when they think I can't hear. I am not a burden, a checklist, or an inheritance plan. I am the breath between trees. I am a page they forgot I once wrote. Then on a Tuesday the phone rang, a number I didn't recognize. I answered not out of curiosity, but instinct. Mom. It was Elise. Her voice was raw. I know you probably don't want to hear from me, she began, but I need to say something. I didn't respond. Let the silence do the filtering. We were wrong, she said. Still, I said nothing. I think we forgot you were a person before you were our mother. That struck something in me. Not forgiveness, but recognition. A moment of rare truth. Elise continued. We treated you like a piece of the estate. And that's not who you are. That's not who Dad saw. I guess we got caught up. Her voice cracked. We didn't know you had it in you. Now I spoke. That's the part that hurts, I said softly. That, after everything, I still had to prove I was worth being listened to. A pause. Then I'm sorry. It was genuine. And still, I didn't invite her back in. After the call ended, I took Scout down to the lake. The snow was melting now, exposing soft earth beneath the pine needles. I knelt and planted the first seed in the garden Martin and I once dreamed of building together. Lavender. He always said it smelled like stillness. I had more seeds waiting. Tomatoes, sage, climbing roses. Not for harvest. For presence. For beauty. For proof that I was still growing long after they tried to prune me out of my own life. Later that evening, I opened the small wooden box I'd begun filling over the past few weeks. Inside were letters. Not to my children. To strangers. To women like me. I'd been writing them through an online forum. Connie introduced me to women over 60 who were navigating betrayal, abandonment, manipulation. I shared my story not as advice, but as a lantern. Here's what I did, I wrote. Here's how it felt. Here's how I came back to myself. Some wrote back, some didn't. That wasn't the point. The point was that every time I pressed pen to paper, I reclaimed a little more space in the world. Then came another surprise. A package. No return label. Inside, a small framed photo of Martin and me taken on our 30th anniversary, restored and reprinted. The glass was new, the frame hand-carved. A note was tucked behind it. I found this in the attic. I thought you'd want it. I'm sorry I forgot you were someone before you were ours. Philip. I stared at the note for a long time. Scout nudged my hand. I know, I whispered. It's something, but not everything. I placed the photo on the mantel above the fireplace, not because I forgave them, but because I remembered me. The me in that picture. The woman who laughed with her whole chest. Who wore soft earrings and hard truths. Who knew that silence could be louder than shouting. She hadn't gone anywhere. She'd just been waiting to be invited back. Spring arrived gently like an apology after a long, hard winter. The lake thawed, the trees stretched green fingers toward the sky, and the air began to hum with the quiet certainty of life returning. Scout and I spent our mornings on the back path near the ridge, where Martin had once dreamed of building a bench. I built it myself. 3 planks, sanded edges, nothing fancy but solid. Sometimes I sat there and read the letters I received, more now from women I'd never met, thanking me for speaking the words they were never allowed to say aloud. I moved out of my daughter's house and into a studio apartment. I sleep better now. I filed for financial separation from my son. I finally have my own bank account. Your story made me remember I have one too. These weren't grand gestures. They were small revolutions. And each one felt like a wildflower blooming through cracked concrete. One morning, I found a car parked at the end of the path leading to the cabin. It was Elise's. She was alone, standing by the hood with something in her hands. When she saw me, she didn't wave. Just waited. Scout stayed beside me, tail relaxed, reading the tension in the air. I approached slowly. When I was a few feet away, she held out a manila envelope. What's that? I asked. My copy of Dad's will, she said. I read it properly this time. I didn't respond. I saw how he wrote about you, she continued. How he wanted you protected. How he trusted you to carry forward what mattered. She paused. I didn't understand before, but I think I do now. I didn't reach for the envelope. Then why are you giving it to me? Because I don't want it anymore, she said. The house, the arguments, the inheritance, none of it. It's poison. Her voice shook. I think we made something ugly out of something sacred. Still, I didn't take the envelope. She placed it on the ground instead. A quiet offering. Then she looked up at me with tear-bright eyes. Do you hate us? I thought about that for a moment. No, I said softly, but I no longer protect you from the consequences of your choices. She nodded, wiped her cheek, then asked, Do you think we can ever? I shook my head gently. Not now, I said. Maybe not ever. But I wish you peace. She didn't cry, but something in her face fractured just slightly. She turned, got in the car, and drove away, without another word. I didn't pick up the envelope. I let it sit there until the wind took it into the brush. Whatever was inside no longer held value. The only document that mattered was already sealed in a fireproof box under my bed, my own will, my own story told in my own hand. The next morning, I placed a wooden sign at the foot of the trail leading to the cabin. Carved into it one word: sanctuary. Not just for me, but for every version of me I had been forced to abandon to please someone else. Scout's legs were getting slower now. He struggled to climb the porch steps, so I built him a little ramp. He still wagged his tail every time I opened the door, even on days when his joints protested. He had grown gray and quiet, like me, but there was still fire in both of us. That night, I lit candles throughout the cabin, not because of a power outage, because I wanted to feel the flicker of flame again, the warmth that can't be manufactured by switches or sockets. I poured a glass of wine, set out a plate of cheese and crackers, and toasted Martin's empty chair. To legacy, I said. Not the kind you pass down, but the kind you protect. Scout barked once in approval. We sat in silence. And it was enough, because I had rewritten the ending they had planned for me. And, in my version, I didn't shrink. I didn't obey. I didn't vanish. I expanded into every inch of space they said I no longer needed. The next day, I received a letter in the mail. Not from Philip. Not from Elise. It was from a local community organization, the Pine Haven Women's Collective. They had received the donation I'd arranged through Connie. My name would be added to a new reading center for elder women starting over. They wanted to honor me with a small ceremony in town. I sat with that envelope for a long time, fingers brushing the edges, heart unsure how to receive gratitude when so much of my life had been spent giving without it. But I said yes, not because I needed the attention, but because showing up for yourself is also a kind of healing. The town hall was small, no more than 30 people in folding chairs. A few familiar faces, a few strangers, and one young woman named Camilla, who reminded me of Elise, only softer, less guarded. She introduced me to the room. Dorothy Elridge. She said, taught for years. Preserved stories, built a home, and when that home became a battleground, she chose peace instead of war, dignity instead of permission. There was a small applause. I stood at the podium, hands steady. I didn't come here because I won, I said. I came because I remembered I didn't have to lose. A few gasps, a few tears. I continued. I lived a life of polite silence. I said yes when I meant maybe, and maybe when I meant no. I thought that made me kind. It didn't. It made me disappear. I looked out at the women in front of me, faces weathered and beautiful. And then one day I remembered the sound of my own voice. And I used it. After the speech, a woman named Helen approached me, hair snow white and eyes sharp like a hawk. You made me remember, she said, that I don't have to die in my daughter's spare room waiting for permission to open the window. We hugged. Scout, who had come along and waited quietly by the side of the room, wagged his tail once in her direction. On the way home, I stopped at a local bakery and bought a small chocolate tart. Martin's favorite. Scout and I shared it on the porch under the fading light. No words. Just crumbs, breath, and presence. That evening, I checked my email for the first time in days. There was one from Philip. Subject line: we're selling the house. No message. No warmth. Just business. I deleted it, and then emptied the trash. The next morning, I woke early, made a pot of strong coffee, packed a small bag. Scout's leash was already waiting by the door. We were going on a trip. Not far, just a few hours to a neighboring town with a small artist residency that accepted elder women as guests. I had signed up for a week-long writing retreat. Memoir poetry journals. No judgment. No deadlines. Just stories. Mine. As I drove, Scout's head rested on the passenger seat, wind fluttering his ears. I thought about everything I used to be responsible for: every casserole, every crisis, every chore. Now all I carried was my truth. And a bag with 3 notebooks. When we arrived, the host greeted me like an old friend. She handed me a key to a small cottage behind a garden. Inside there was a desk, a lamp, a window that overlooked the hills. I set down my things and opened my journal. At the top of a fresh page I wrote, "I was told to shrink, but I stretched instead. Into sky, into silence, into the woman I had long forgotten." Scout curled up by the window, and I began. The writing retreat turned out to be more than a change of scenery. It was a revelation. Each day began with a silent breakfast, then 3 hours of writing. No phones, no clocks, just pens and stories and breath. At first I wasn't sure what to write, but once the first sentence spilled out, the rest followed like a storm. I was once a woman no one saw unless they needed something. I handed out casseroles and comfort like currency. I raised children who learned to expect me not to appreciate me. And then I left, not to hurt them, but to find the parts of me they had forgotten. The parts I had abandoned too. The retreat facilitator, a soft-spoken woman named Luann, asked if I'd like to read my piece aloud at the closing circle. I hesitated, and then said yes. That final night, we gathered in the common room, a circle of women ranging from 30 to nearly 80. Candles flickered. Mugs of tea warmed hands and laps. Someone brought a tin of lemon shortbread. When it was my turn, I stood. I read slowly, clearly, letting each word land. And when I reached the end of my story, there was no applause. There was silence. A silence thick with knowing, with recognition. And then one by one they spoke. A widow who'd been forced to move into her daughter's basement. A professor who'd spent her entire career being passed over for promotion. A grandmother whose son had asked her to sell her house so he could buy a boat. We were strangers, and yet not, because our stories rhymed. And in that moment, I understood something deeper than anger, deeper than even justice. I understood communion, the sacred kind shared not through religion, but through reclamation. When I returned to the cabin, I felt lighter. The dog barked as I pulled up, tail wagging, and I laughed out loud in the driveway. Scout, my silent witness to all things, had waited without question. I unpacked, lit a fire, and placed my retreat journal on the mantel beside Martin's photo. Then I made tea. And for the first time since my husband passed, I danced in the kitchen. Not for show, not to please. Just because the kettle took too long and the music on the radio was good and I had a body, and it still moved. A few days later, a letter arrived. This one wasn't from my children. It was from the Pine Haven Women's Collective. They wanted to publish my retreat piece in a quarterly newsletter titled Echoes. They offered no money, just a platform, a voice, a place for my words to live. I said yes, and then wrote 2 more essays. One morning, while planting tulips along the edge of the porch, my neighbor Sam walked up with a small paper bag. "Thought you might want some of these," he said, handing me heirloom tomato seeds. They came from my mother's garden. I accepted them with both hands. "I'll treat them like gold." He tipped his hat. "I know you will." That night, I sat at the porch with Scout. The stars were beginning to pierce the dusk, and the air smelled like spring, wet earth pine hope. I sipped my wine and whispered, "They'll never understand why I left." Scout looked at me, blinking slowly. "And that's okay," I said, because I had stopped chasing closure. What I had now was something better. Continuance. A life that kept going. On my terms. In my time. Without permission. Without apology. The lake began to warm. On still afternoons, I'd sit on the dock with my feet in the water, the ripples fanning out gently beneath me like threads of memory loosening their grip. One such afternoon, I received a knock. Not on the door, on the porch beam. Sam stood there holding a bundle of small envelopes. "Post office dropped these off at my place by mistake," he said. I took them, flipping through. Utility ads. 2 flyers and 1 envelope that made my heart hitch. No return address, but the handwriting was unmistakable. "Philip." I thought about tossing it into the fire, but I didn't. I opened it. "Mom." I didn't know how much I was repeating the same mistakes Dad used to complain about from his own parents. We weren't close like we used to be. I know that, and I tried to fix that by organizing and planning. But really, I should have just sat with you. Just asked how you were. Just listened. I don't expect anything. But if there's ever a time you want to talk, I'll come to you. Not for the house. Not for inheritance. Just for you. Love. Philip. I folded the letter carefully, not out of sentiment, out of ceremony. Then I placed it in Martin's old box with the others, let it sit among the quiet things. That evening, I roasted potatoes in duck fat and cooked carrots from the garden. Scout watched every move, waiting for a dropped scrap. I gave him 3. You've earned more than they have, I said aloud. He gave a soft bark, agreeing as always. The next day, I sat with Connie at the edge of the county courthouse steps, sipping coffee and reviewing the final transfer documents for the Wildlife Trust. You're giving away a lot, she said. I'm giving away what they tried to take, I corrected. She smiled. That's a quote worth framing. Maybe I'll put it on the dock, I mused. For when the grandkids come visit someday, if they ever want to find me on their own. And if they don't, I shrugged. Then I'll still be here, with Scout. And tomatoes. The papers were signed. The land was safe. My cabin, my sanctuary was mine until my last breath. And beyond that, a space preserved for women like me. It felt like planting something in time. Roots, not debts. I spent that evening crafting a wind chime from broken teacups, beads, and old keys. Things that once belonged to my former life, now singing something new in the breeze. When it hung just right, I stepped back and listened. It sounded like freedom. That weekend, a young woman arrived at my door. She introduced herself as Marisol, one of the interns from the Pine Haven Women's Collective. I was hoping to interview you, she said. Your story. It's helping people, especially women in transition. We'd like to profile you for our next feature. I paused. Do I have to pose for a photo? She grinned. Only if you want to. I made tea. Told my story. The real one. The one not in bank statements or legal documents. About Martin. About the house. About Scout. And about the silence that had saved me more than any shouting ever had. Marisol took notes. Asked gentle questions. Before she left, she said, "You don't sound angry." I replied, but then I realized anger is loud and short-lived. What I wanted was to be unreachable. Did it work? Yes, I said, smiling. And then I became unforgettable. That night, Scout curled beside me by the fire. I pulled a new notebook from the drawer and wrote one line across the top of the page. You cannot downsize a woman who remembers everything. The next letter came not by mail, but by hand. I was tending to the garden, pulling weeds, whispering encouragement to the stubborn snapdragons, when I heard a car engine slow on the gravel road. I stood, brushed soil from my knees. Elise stepped out of a rental car. No makeup, no jewelry, no clipboard of plans. Just a small piece of paper clutched in her hand. Scout patted to my side tail, neither wagging nor warning. Just watching. Hi, Mom, she said. Afternoon, I replied, measured. I'm not staying, she added quickly. Just wanted to leave this. She extended the paper. I hesitated, then took it. Before I could unfold it, she turned back toward the car. But halfway there, she paused and looked back. I started therapy, she said. That caught me off guard. She shifted her weight awkwardly. Turns out, I've been trying to control everything because I didn't know how to grieve. I stayed silent. She offered a small, sad smile. I don't expect anything. I just wanted you to know. Then she left. No performance, no push. Just truth dropped like a pebble into water. Inside the cabin, I unfolded the note. Mom, I gave away Scout's leash too soon. I didn't think about what he meant to you, or what you meant to him. I saw the photo they published in the collective's newsletter. You looked free. I'm sorry it took me this long to recognize the mother who raised me. Love, Elise. I folded the note once, placed it next to Philip's letter in Martin's box. Then I poured myself a glass of wine and walked out to the ridge. The lake shimmered. The wind tugged gently at my sleeves. And for the first time in this long journey, I allowed myself a simple but radical thought. Maybe I had been loved. Poorly. Imperfectly. But loved nonetheless. It didn't excuse the betrayals. It didn't erase the hurt. But it meant I could release the bitterness like breath. Not to let them back in, but to let me move forward without the weight of carrying their wrongdoings. That night, I dreamed of Scout as a puppy darting through the house, ears flapping, Martin laughing in the background. When I woke, the real Scout was stretched out by the fireplace, dreaming too, feet twitching. I reached for my journal and began writing again. There is a kind of revenge that doesn't burn anything down. It simply builds something they can't enter. A few days later, I opened my email to find something new. An invitation to speak at a storytelling summit for women, reclaiming their lives after loss. It wasn't glamorous. No spotlight. No big city. But it was important. They wanted my voice. The one that had once been drowned in casserole dishes and carpool schedules. I accepted. Sam helped me patch the roof before the first summer rains. He didn't talk much that day. Just handed me nails, steadied the ladder, and hummed quietly to himself. When we were done, we sat on the porch with lemonade. "Place suits you," he said. "I think I was always meant to end up here." I replied. Even after all that happened. Especially after all that happened. That night, I wrote a final essay for the collective. I titled it, "The House They Wanted, the Woman They Lost." In it, I described the moment I closed my own front door, not with anger, but intention. How I carried nothing but a dog, a deed, and the kind of peace that only comes when you stop asking to be understood. I ended the piece with one sentence. Sometimes the best kind of closure is the one that locks behind you as you walk away with the keys in your own pocket. Scout sighed in his sleep. The wind picked up, and I smiled to myself. They told me to downsize. Instead, I became a universe they could no longer measure. The summer settled in thick with golden light and slow afternoons. The tomatoes ripened faster than I could eat them, so I started leaving baskets at the edge of the trail, one for Sam, another for the mail carrier, and sometimes anonymously for the women's shelter in town. Giving, I realized, was no longer a duty. It was now a choice. One I made without expectation, without anyone keeping score. Scout had started sleeping more during the day, his movements slower, stiffer. I added a second cushion to his bed and took our walks slower. He still insisted on coming even when I offered to let him rest. One morning, we reached the ridge, just as the sun broke through the trees. He sat beside me, wheezing slightly but content, eyes closed as the breeze danced around us. I knew his days were winding down, but I also knew he had lived a life of purpose. He had guarded the house I loved, followed me into exile, and laid at my feet while I rebuilt my life from a pile of silence and ash. He had done his job, and I would help him finish it with dignity. That afternoon, I took a worn piece of driftwood from the lake and carved his name into it, Scout. I planted it in the soil beside the garden near the lavender bush. Not for now, but for when the time came. And when it did, I promised him he would not go to some sterile room or cold floor. He would pass where he had lived in sunlight on a bed that smelled like me, hearing my voice one last time. A good death. A faithful ending. The kind I had learned to give myself to. That evening, I received one last email. From Elise. "Mom, I know you're not obligated to respond. I just wanted you to know that I finally understand why you left. I was raised by a woman who gave everything, and I forgot she was still a person under all that giving. I hope one day we get to meet again, not as mother and daughter, but as women who have rebuilt themselves. With love, Elise." I didn't reply, but I didn't delete it either. Instead, I filed it away in a folder labeled Quiet Miracles. Scout passed a week later. In the early morning beside the fire, his head resting on my foot. I held him as he took his last breath. And I did not cry. Not then. I simply whispered thank you and stayed still long after he was gone. I buried him near the lake beneath the tree Martin had always wanted to build a swing from. I placed the driftwood marker and added a single stone on top. The wind rustled gently through the pine. He was home. So was I. The next morning, I brewed a pot of coffee and sat on the dock with a clean page in my journal. I wrote, "This is not the story of what they took. This is the story of what I reclaimed. My voice, my time, my space, my breath, my ending." And then beneath it, a final line. "You told me to downsize, so I did down to the truth." A bird landed on the railing, the same kind Martin used to feed crumbs to in the mornings. I broke a corner off my toast and placed it beside me. The bird pecked at it once, then flew away. No thanks, no fanfare, just wings. And that, I thought, was exactly enough. The story they tell about women like me, older, quieter, long past our prime, is that we fade. that we retreat into smaller homes, smaller lives, smaller voices. But I didn't shrink. I shed. I peeled off expectations like brittle wallpaper, tore down the scaffolding of self-sacrifice they mistook for love, and walked into the wilderness with only a deed, a dog, and my memory. I was never weak. I was waiting. Waiting for the noise to stop. Waiting for the contracts to expire. Waiting to hear myself again. And when I did, I wrote a new ending. One where I didn't beg to be heard. One where I didn't fight for crumbs of affection from children raised on entitlement. One where I claimed what was mine without apology, without a performance. Some will call this story revenge. Let them. I call it reclamation. I call it peace. I call it truth. So if you're still in the home they're trying to sell out from under you, if you're still the grandmother who's become in the way, if you're still the widow they assume will quietly fade, hear this. You don't owe them your silence. You don't owe them your house. You don't even owe them a goodbye. Take the deed, take the dog, and go build the life they forgot you had a right to. You are not a leftover. You are a legacy. And your story isn't over. It's just finally yours.